cultures and science. Ben Franklin is one way to start the story of American science. His explorations of electricity and lightning in the late 1740s and early 1750s were remarkable for their dangerous nature and also for the insight he was able to gain into the natural world. In 1730, when Franklin was just 24, a young homeowner and beginning printer, Philadelphia had a devastating fire along the wharfs, and that event made an impression. Franklin was always a voracious learner, but when he had reached his early 40s, his print business was well established and he had a little more time to explore his interests. And he was keenly interested in the works of other experimenters in electricity. When he famously flew the key on the kite in 1752, he was trying to deduce the fundamental character of lightning. Was it indeed, as some believed, electricity? But his practical purpose was just as profound. He wanted to determine a way to keep Philadelphia buildings and homes safe from lightning strikes. As a business owner, he personally had a stake in improving the safety of the city. Now, he won a medal from the Royal Society, which was established about 90 years earlier in 1660, for his work in this field. So keep this practical versus fundamental knowledge in mind. We'll come back to it. And since one place to start the story of science itself was with the founding of the Royal Society in 1660, it makes sense to bring America into the picture with Franklin. But despite his significant contributions and despite our fondness for him, Franklin is not the place to start the story of science in the Americas. That said, a few lessons from Ben will help us. We want to keep the distinction between basic and applied science in mind, and we also want to remind ourselves that science is inseparable from power politics. And if you want to know more about the politics of lightning rods, you can see this short article which I have linked in the notes. In this lecture, we're going to uncover the story of the Americas and the Maya, and as we uncover that story, we're going to consider historical significance, particularly losses and what-ifs. We're going to think a little bit about what our understanding of science is in relationship to history and politics. I'd also like to remind you that I wrote this lecture to add some material that's not in the book. I want for us to think a little bit about where we're going, and this lecture, in fact, connects to the last lecture by asking the question, what if? As I said to you, in the telling of history, we consider three things. Did it happen? Does it matter? And could it have happened any other way? That is, first, what evidence shows us that something actually happened? Are we using written sources or physical artifacts or both? In the case of American science, this turns out to be a pretty important question. About the second question, does it matter? I have said that historical significance had 5 qualities. The first 4 are permanence, with the example of the clock, magnitude, with the example of the nuclear bomb, potential, with the example of the printing press, and quality, with the example of tomatoes. And the 5th quality was loss, something you can't get back from. I don't know if you picked up on the little picture in Art, Language, and Science, The Ice Age. That picture was Adam and Eve being exiled from the Garden of Eden. The door is shut, you can't get back in. Maybe in our lifetime, an event of important permanent loss is the moment we passed 400 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. From this moment, it just may be impossible to get back. So this third question, the inflection point, are we experiencing a trend that's impossible to escape, or could some person have made a difference? In that American story, that last question haunts the narrative. It also hangs over any and every consideration of the future. In the Americas, we will look at some of the really awful outcomes and ask, could it have happened any other way? And not to start on such a melancholy tone, we will consider some recent ways in which historians are changing their minds about the Americas. We will examine the accomplishments of one particular well-studied group, the Maya, and as I said, we will test out our definitions of science again. If we use Patricia Farah's guidance and go with a culture that has a written language, that narrows the field a lot. There weren't many cultures with any form of a written language in the Americas. The Maya peoples are the great exception. The full decipherment of the Mayan written language started in the 1890s, but didn't reach reasonably accurate decipherment until the early 1990s. So let's let you try your hand at it. Here you see the numbers 16, 4, 9, and 13. If you're a puzzle type person, you'll be able to work out what the bar and the dot in this row of figures represents. And if you want to look it up, there's a link with some interesting exercises in the notes. The Mayans also had a way to represent 0, and that is a discovery they made themselves, independently of any other culture who might have had that idea, and there were only a few in the world who did have that idea. They had a need and a reason for it, which we'll see. Let's talk about alone. For thousands of years, the Americas were alone as regards innovation and the development of knowledge. Geography was a limitation and a boundary. The cultures of the Americas developed in their own context of needs and concerns. One feature unique to the Americas was the limited number of animals that were or could be domesticated. Llamas, alpacas, turkeys, dogs, guinea pigs, and Muscovy ducks are the handful that could be tamed and used. The net effect was that the peoples of the Americas had far less immunity than Europeans did to the broad variety of diseases that were and could be swapped between humans and domesticated animals. Europeans had developed a range of immunities over thousands of years, and as we know from our recent pandemic experience, those animal-human disease swaps with no developed immunity can be devastating. When the Europeans showed up looking for trade and resources, they delivered a deadly exchange. European diseases decimated the Americas with a population loss of up to 90%. Artists in the Americas recorded what the devastation looked like. Friar Bernardino de Sahagún, a Franciscan, composed an ethnographical study of the Aztecs, which is now called the Florentine Codex. He began in 1545 and, collaborating with the native artists, worked on this study until his death in 1590. His study stretched to 12 books of 2,400 pages. So you can look at the Florentine Codex, which is pictured in this slide, with an introduction, and then at the Library of Congress I put those notes there. But the story is pretty awful. And if you're interested in the history of disease, I've also linked a really excellent course, and I've also linked a book that I think you might be interested in called Guns, Germs, and Steel. Some, but not a lot of indigenous thought about nature is available in writing, and there weren't a lot of Americans left to tell the story about what they thought, what problems they were solving, how their instruments helped them to predict and control the natural world around them. But even with the lack of written sources, there are some recent reconsiderations of history that we thought we knew. With new dating techniques, new translation, new tools in archaeology, new facts have been coming to light over the last 40 years. We're moving the dates earlier, we're asking again about indigenous achievements, and we're adding to the story of science in America as scientists are taking a new look. Until recently, received wisdom was that people were living in the Americas from 13,000 BCE onward, and not before. The group that settled across North America were called Clovis people from the distinctive arrow and spearheads that were found at Clovis, New Mexico, and then in so many other sites. The people who made these weapons and tools shared the same technology, and therefore they shared geography and material culture practice. But the assertion that no one came to the Americas before 13,000 BCE started to receive challenges about 15 or so years ago. Archaeologists started to argue about the radiocarbon dates at particular sites, and the debates moved from quiet ones to loud ones. Recently, it's been accepted that some sites are older. The concept is, and was, that people came into the Americas over a land bridge from Eurasia and then rapidly traveled down and slowly traveled across the two continents. So a paradigm shift is a change in the basic facts that most people believe, either in a culture or in a connected group. And you can chase the story of this particular paradigm shift through Archaeology magazine, and I've got a few links in the notes. And if you're in the mood to take a road trip and look for yourself, one such earlier site is sort of local. It's Meadowcroft, Pennsylvania, about an hour west of Pittsburgh, on the border of Pennsylvania and the tiny spine of West Virginia. Why does a redating of American settlement matter? It means that we might find art in settlements that are earlier than we thought, and there may be more discoveries out there to explore. Some of them may change the story of science. Historians and scientists have to take stock and rethink sometimes because new data may be brought to light or old data takes a reconsideration. When I was a kid, I was taught that the Americas were basically empty. The settlers needed to move west and fill in that empty land. And that's just fundamentally untrue. And I'm hoping that you were taught a slightly different story. So let's take a moment and have a look at what was there in the Americas. Going clockwise and starting at the center, there is a Sioux, a Dakota winter count blanket, a history-telling device. Next to it is the Hiawatha Belt of the Onondaga Nations, representing an alliance between 5 nations. Then, below, is a cloak from the Powhatan people group, that is the tribe of Pocahontas who married John Rolfe and who has some 10,000 descendants today. Below that is a marble statue from the Mound Builders of Georgia, and to the left is the pottery of the Pueblo peoples of the Southwest. Above that is a vivid Kwakiutl bird mask, and then there's a lovely little swimming polar bear of the Inuit. Here's art and history and politics and religion and culture. North America was full of people responding fully to the problems presented by the natural world. And I'll pause here to say that this lecture has been tough to write simply because I've bitten off more than I can chew on both continents, and certainly with a focus on the Maya. Meso and South America is our next destination, but for what it's worth, there are 2 interesting science and tech moments that you may not have seen in North America and that I think you could explore if you like. The first are these so-called banner stones, which were produced between 6000 BCE and 3000 BCE. Essentially, that's before the pyramids and then around the time of the Niebuhr sky disk. Consider the labor and technology, the chipping, the carving, the polishing that were needed to produce these items. They're beautiful. They were weights for throwing spears. They fit on spears, or some of them were. Some seemed too big for the purpose. And archaeologists wonder, were they for trade or status or home hunting use? We're not sure. If these images intrigue you, the Fashion Institute of Technology is a good place to start. One other technology of note is the North American Old Copper culture. It's a mining tradition around the Great Lakes area. Artifacts like this, that is, these spearheads and these axe heads and these fishhooks, were produced between approximately 4000 BCE and 1000 BCE. That's before the pyramids, through Stonehenge, and right up to the founding of Rome. These sites, with their copper tools, are something that many people are unfamiliar with, and I think that you might like to know a little bit more about. One more thought before we get to the Maya. The indigenous farmers of the Americas made a huge contribution to the rest of the world through a long project of cultivation. They solved for themselves and for everyone else the getting enough to eat problem with potatoes and corn. Both were inedible in their original form. Both took centuries to develop into their edible forms today. Cultivation over centuries meant that knowledge was being passed down. The habit of centuries-long knowledge development seems to be an American habit, as we will see. So, moving south, let's turn to Mexico, Mesoamerica, and South America. Cultures and sites we could explore include the Norte Chico culture, the Olmec, the Aztec, and the Inca. All of them engaged in skywatching, and some developed dating systems and information storage. We'll come back to the Taino when we talk about Columbus. But how about the Maya? Who are the Maya, and why do we want them in the history of science? In the 3 decades after Columbus's voyages, the Spanish encountered and conquered, in rapid succession, the Aztecs in present-day Mexico in 1522, and the Incas in present-day Peru in 1533. At the same time, in 1524, they took on the Maya peoples, whom they did not conquer immediately. When Columbus first encountered them in 1502 on his 4th voyage, the Maya had been living in organized polities, that is, cities with spheres of influence, for about 2,000 years. They had a well-developed culture, but the zenith of their cultural power was behind them. They were brought under the rule of the Spanish in a somewhat protracted fashion, with battles starting in 1524 and stretching on to the very last holdout in 1697. During this time of war and resistance, Mayan records were nearly all lost. Mayan written records were nearly all lost. One person in particular, Bishop Diego de Landa, who lived from 1524 to 1579, was sent to serve the Spanish and native Christians in the Yucatan, and he burned an unknown number of Maya books. He did also record cultural observations and offered a written key to Maya hieroglyphs. In essence, He saved the possibility of translation for future historians, but he also destroyed many of the books those future historians would have wanted to have read. What remains? Just 4, only 4, folding Mayan books. That's one of the losses I was talking about. We have no idea what else was written. These books, each one called a codex, or, in plural, codices, are located in Dresden, Paris, Madrid, and Mexico. And pictured here is a facsimile of the Madrid Codex. In what seems like a special dispensation of irony, Bishop Landa's own 1566 book about the Maya was itself lost to scholars until it was found and republished in 1864. Local indigenous Maya culture and practices persisted, but what was known about the Mayan written language, cities, and political endeavors was, for a while, thoroughly lost. In the 1840s, New Jersey lawyer and explorer John Lloyd Stephens was sent on a diplomatic mission by President Van Buren to Central America. There, Stephens visited Copan, a spectacular abandoned city of the Maya. Stephens traveled with a British illustrator, Frederick Catherwood, whose illustrations and engravings, one you're looking at right now, created a public buzz. And this is from Frederick Catherwood's 1844 Views of Ancient Monuments. In fact, the adventure made such a gripping news story that it made its way into Wilkie Collins's sensational 1859 potboiler, Woman in White. That's a Victorian serialized novel. Well, the images captured the European imagination. Who are the people who produced these impressive monuments and buildings? The ruins and cities and stela, that's stone slabs or stela, or statues that have writing. These were spread across the Yucatan Peninsula, but they were buried under the jungle. Clearing the sites and translating the stela took many years. As archaeologists and explorers visited these sites and started to understand and record the glyphs, the story unfolded. So these tourist maps may be a bit hokey, but you can get the feeling of the amazing architecture of the Maya city centers. They show sketches of the principal buildings at various sites in the peninsula. And about 40 years after John Lloyd Stephens uncovered some of the Maya buildings in stela, a librarian in the Dresden State Library, Ernst Wilhelm Forstemann, began studying the very rare Maya codex he held in the collection. Now, it had been written by Maya scribes. About 40 years after John Lloyd Stephens uncovered some Maya buildings in stela, a librarian in the Dresden State Library, Ernst Wilhelm Forstemann, began studying the very rare Maya codex held in the collection. It had been written by Maya scribes around 1300, taken from the Maya by the Spanish and shipped to Europe, probably to the European Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, in the 1530s, and was then obtained as a gift in Vienna by the head librarian Johann Christian Goetze in 1739, and his notes that he indicate that he got it from the previous owner for free because the owner didn't know what it was. Perhaps no one at the time realized that it was one of the rarest books in the world. Well, Forstemann and others deciphered the numbers and realized that the codex showed very accurate cycles of the moon and the planet Venus. This understanding was developed before any other glyphs were translated. For that reason, the English scholar Eric Thompson, who was dominant in the field of Maya hieroglyphs from the 1920s to the 1940s, Thompson believed that the Maya were peaceful scholars focused on star watching. That's all anyone knew about them, and that's what they thought. The Maya cared about time. And many scholars thought that everything else that was written on the stone stela and within the codices that had not been translated were probably untranslatable. The code could not be cracked. But other scholars were not content with that state of affairs. In the meantime, Russian scholar Yuri Knarazov, who had previously studied Egyptian hieroglyphs, started working on a copy he had obtained of the Dresden Codex. In the 1950s, he proposed that the Maya hieroglyphs were syllabic and could be sounded out. So, right, you can see why everyone who tells this story includes his picture, that face, and the cat. You can read up on him through the reference that I've linked in the notes. Now, his ideas about glyphs as syllables were rejected, in part because he was Russian, and the scholars in the West were predisposed to ignore anything coming out of Russia. After the Cold War, Knarazov's concepts were affirmed, by Maya scholars. Now, it so happened that I ran across an article about contributions to Maya decipherment in the early 1990s when I was a young graduate student. I read an article about Linda Shealy, the non-specialist who had made some major breakthroughs. She's pictured there on the right. I looked at the image of the glyphs in the article and I felt uneasy in the way that you do when you see a big crack in something that you thought ought to be sturdy. I recall thinking that this was the craziest language I'd ever seen. So elaborate and so ornate, it had to be idiosyncratic in its production. Could anyone draw these glyphs in the same way twice? How would you learn it? In my cultural worldview, the alphabet is for everyone. How could this system of writing be an alphabet? How could it survive when it could only have ever been a relatively small group of people who could read each other's work? Yes, I did remind myself that in a pre-literate culture, scribes are a special and small class, and they're highly trained. But still, these scribes would have had to have kept talking to each other and kept checking with each other to avoid drift in the way ideas were drawn and conveyed, and that was my impression anyway. So, when I came to write this lecture, I remembered that article, and I was interested in the story of cracking the language, and that story, including the cat, Asya, is told with generosity and verve in a great video called Cracking the Maya Code, which is narrated by Michael Coe, who was a large contributor to this event, so to speak. Outsiders were essential. There was Narasov, whose ideas were discounted for 30 years, Linda Shealy, who was an artist, not a linguist, by training. There's a researcher named Tatiana Proskoryakov, who was originally an architect by training, and she was hugely important to this. Also David Stewart, who was, at the time he was first introduced to the Maya language, a preteen who was spending his summers in the ruins with his archaeologist dad. And all these people made fundamental contributions. So if you like a good yarn, this is one. Just absorbing the complexities and the beauties of the language has been a lifetime of work for some exceptionally fine and collaborative scholars. So, having unlocked much of the language, having translated the stone stele and temple lintels and temple facades and many smaller artifacts, including vases and plates, having cleared the sites and started to use LiDAR to see what can be seen underneath the jungle cover, what do we know now? Well, Maya history is grouped into three major periods: the pre-classic, the classic, and the post-classic. The earliest Maya sites, around 1500 BCE, are located toward the middle and east coast of the Yucatan Peninsula. The last cities occupied until around the 1600s were located in the north and east of the Yucatan Peninsula. And one thing that emerged from studying Maya sites is that there was a general collapse, a cessation of city life in most city centers, somewhere around 900 CE. The dating on the monuments ceases at that point. And the source of the collapse has been a long-running debate among historians. Current scholars agree that there was a pressure brought on by population growth, exhausting wars between cities, and extended drought. And you have here a picture that you can see of this, right? So Maya cities were never organized into an overarching entity. There was nothing that could be called an empire. Instead, there were cities or polities that were constantly aiming for preeminence, willing to go to war to gain control of a rival area, or to get a trade advantage, or to enforce the dominance of a family line. And some of the most active and bitter conflicts were between the cities of Tikal and Calakmul. And because of these shifting rivalries, Maya lords were represented in inscriptions at their own cities and at other cities within their spheres of influence. Careful study of these inscriptions allowed Professor Simon Martin of the University of Pennsylvania to map the most significant relationship between these centers of power. And I've got Calakmul and Tikal plus Copan on the map in blue, and then I had the early and late Maya cities there in purple. And then I just put a couple of amazing art centers, Palenque and Bonampak, also on the map. Anyway, back to Martin. Martin has written two essential books for understanding Maya politics: The Chronicle of the Maya Kings and Queens, and also a book called Ancient Maya Politics, a political anthropology of the classic period, 150 to 900 CE. And I've put in a couple of links to those things that you can read them and see them for yourself. Now he concludes that Maya states maintained a balance, partly aided by their shared culture, a belief in moral order. The Maya expected their holy lords or kings to be seated as kings in the city center through ritual. they and their constituents were vested in the idea that ritual, history, and cyclical time undergirds power. Now, why does this matter? Science is setting culture. To understand science, you need to understand its host culture. So pictured here are two cities, El Mirador and Chichen Itza, one from the early period, that's El Mirador, and one of the later periods of Maya flourishing. So the Maya created and maintained impressive and efficient urban landscapes for over 2,000 years. Given these long periods and the intensity of the connections, we would expect to see practical solutions to practical problems, as we did in Rome and China and the Arab world. And so we also do in the Maya polities. Here's Chichen Itza, beautiful and striking. So the Maya built roads in and out of city centers, which held plazas for displays, like this one, and ritual and burial, as well as places for trade and courts and for ball games. Homes and neighborhoods spread out across the cities. Farming plots were incorporated into the landscape. And here's a look at that through LiDAR. LiDAR is a kind of radar that penetrates the jungle cover and reveals ground structures that you can't see, and it's rewriting our understanding of the size of Maya cities and populations. There's a growing astonishment and wonder at the scope of what they accomplished. With this new tool, it's a great time to be an archaeologist or a Mayanist. And I've got a couple of episodes and things linked in for you to take a look at. Now, among the problems that the Maya had to solve was the use of water. With the exception of the Usumacinta, which is a little river system that kind of goes from Tabasco inward, there really are no above-ground rivers on the Yucatan Peninsula. There are water sinkholes called cenotes, and they were treated as sacred sites, and they were used as water sources, and they're all through. But they're not so regular as to be predictable. So if you're a city, you need to make some man-made cisterns, and that's indeed what the Maya did. Chultun is the name given to reservoirs that allowed for bathing, drinking, cooking. And of course, if you have a massive city center with temples and tombs and ball courts, there's going to be construction that's going to require the water that you need to mix to make the lime mortar. And so these water management systems are new areas of research. And if you're interested in that, I've linked a couple of articles for you to take a look at. Then I mentioned trade here. I've pictured a Maya, actually it's an Aztec headdress because it's the closest thing I could find to a Maya headdress, and it is in the Welt Museum in Vienna. I've also pictured here a salt trader and someone trading in Quetzal feathers. So cloth and salt and luxury goods like these feathers, these beautiful green feathers, were traded across the peninsula. And salt is especially essential for any city that needs to function because you need to be able to preserve food. So the ability to organize food preservation, trade, travel, essential water reservoirs, these are all practical problems that the Maya solved. And because I kind of like salt and I'm interested in that as a separate issue, I've linked a couple of salt articles for you. But here's the thing. There's nothing written, no list of payments to builders or farmers or artists, nothing to tell us that the Maya valued the skills that allowed them to build roads, pyramids, temples, and water systems. What they thought about the extensive work that they did is unknown. So how do we describe the Mayan social investment in what we would regard as a scientific program? What would show us that they were interested in control or prediction, hidden forces? What would show us that they used observation of nature to solve those problems? Well, we do know the answer, but let's take a look at it again a little more closely. The Maya kept extensive records of their observations of Venus, the moon, the sun, and eclipses. They captured an understanding of cycles which would have taken decades or even centuries to develop. The codices we have and can understand are the most obvious evidence of Maya commitment to recording and sharing observations across generations. Many sites and cities have an E-group. An E-group is some variant of this arrangement, 3 temples facing a larger radial pyramid, so placed as to track the solstices and the equinoxes. The late classic city Chichen Itza is the site of an unmistakable observation tower, a multi-layer spiral called caracol. And most interesting to me is the assertion according to the archaeoastronomer Anthony Aveni and the epigrapher Michael Coe, that the Maya corrected their records every century or so. So what drives the need for accurate or coordinated records? And countering this assertion of exactitude, in his book, The Order of Days, The Maya World and the Truth About 2012, David Stewart argues that the Maya observations were not so extraordinarily correct. In fact, calendar priests made adjustments so as to fit the purposes of humans, not reflect the heavens. We'll come back to that. The calendar structure, called the calendar round, is quite a bit more complex than the one we use daily. It has interrelated cycles, a 13-day cycle, a 20-day cycle, and a 365-day solar cycle. Taken together, the entire interlocking cycle can be completed in 52 years. The effect is to measure long periods of time and to require a complex set of mathematical interactions to know specific future dates. There's also an important 260-day cycle related to human gestation, the moon, and Venus. And there's a shorter cycle of 20 years, which is handy for political leaders who are recording birth, death, and what the Mayans called being seated as a holy lord. Now below and left, or in your screen and left, is an image of 1320 in this 365 days interlinked. And the Dresden Codex on the right shows the annual world-renewing deluge being poured out of the mouth of a crocodile, it looks like, and being captured in a pot. Across many places and over a long period of time, the Maya shared a common long count calendar, which begins on our 3114 BCE date. Many stela reference this date. Scholars debated and eventually worked out how to make the correlation between the Julian calendar and the Maya, and this date is the consensus of most. Scribes, we need to say, are elite, essential, and dangerous. The question of who keeps and conveys knowledge is central to science, and how problems are posed and solved is a cultural issue. So what cultural problems are solved with knowledge? If the ritual calendar knowledge is the province of scribes or calendar priests, then scribes are essential. Scribes are figured in illustrations as one of the many Maya gods. Actual living scribes are probably the brothers or lesser sons of nobles. They are part of the reigning elite, and they're invested in the power structure. To my understanding, there are no women figured as scribes or shown in this function. Since living scribes are elites, one might think that they would have names or be shown on stela or in documents. And that's not the case. They're featured on vases, they're featured in books, but there are no names. Most stela feature only the king or the king's allies or subordinate lords with names. In a few limited places, scribes were allowed to sign their own names on very high-status ceramics or high-status stelae or architectural facades, certain works of art. That said, scribes are powerfully important because they keep track of the days, and the days matter because kings connected themselves to the authority of the ancient gods through the calendar. The idea is this. Kingly legitimacy was established through the ability to reproduce a past or future calendar when a god had done the same thing that the king was going to do. So when kings established themselves, they would need to make a reference to what a god had done. So when the king does what an older god had done at the same time in the past, that action gave them authority here and now. And also time itself was imagined as a series of gods seated at the various sacred periods within the calendar. So when a king, or sometimes a queen, started to reign, the ruler was seated at a sacred time as a holy lord, and somehow also became the embodiment of that sacred time. So in both ways, replicating time and being time, rulers were divine and authoritative. The calendar gave the days and times for rituals that reinforced this elite divinity. So a scribe's work was to anchor a dynasty with a claim to time and a claim to divinity. Does all this seem impossible and strange? Yes, maybe. But is it impossibly alien? No. We have some cultural connections to these ideas. If you think of the structure of Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol, You'll remember that Ebenezer Scrooge meets the spirits of Christmas past, present, and future, and that's time embodied. You may also think of the New Year's parades with Father Time and the New Year's Baby. I haven't finished watching them, but I think the Loki series, the Disney Channel's Marvel Universe series, also has timekeepers in the storyline. So we have a few of these embodiments of time and guardians of time ourselves in our stories. And you may also remember from history in the English Civil War, as well as the following Glorious Revolution, that the English rejected the idea of the divine right of kings. So the Maya are well within the broader world culture to have entertained these ideas about time and authority and kingship and divinity. With reference to enforcing authority, the Maya practiced blood sacrifice as part of their calendar rituals, and they had a variety of rather disturbing ways to draw their own blood, and also on some occasions to execute captives and offer their blood. This picture here is of the young maize god, and you can see that his wrists are wrapped because he has been letting blood as a ritual sacrifice. And you can also see current kings doing the same thing. The famous Lord Itzamnaj Balam III and Lady Shak of Yaxchilan. And that particular image, which is pretty striking, is also a little disturbing, so I'm going to link it in the notes and you can click on it if you want to. I don't know if this provides a useful insight or not, but the closest European analogy I can think of to the complex Maya calendar is the town clock, the horloge, in Prague. On the face of this oldest of the working medieval town clocks is a dial with at least 3 different systems for reckoning the hours. One of them includes a zodiac that reckons the months. The lower dial records a yearly church calendar of saints' days, and that means that you have a long-standing set of beliefs about what days have appropriate actions associated with them. So the horloge is the habitation of a series of understandings and images of time, which are both colorful and monitory. The animated figures that decorate the clock and are worked by the clock offer a cacophonous round of the stages of life. In a kind of funhouse day-long peep show, which we see the daily round of orderly disciples and saints, and then we also see what monsters may threaten us, and we can watch the figure of death who rings the hourly bell. We see what waits for us all. I wonder if the Mayan calendar didn't operate with somewhat the same sensibility. Just as skilled medieval and Renaissance technicians were required to keep the horloge working, and they couldn't always do so, Maya scribes controlled access to the calendar cycles of their world, and with this understanding, scribes could be considered dangerous. The Bonampak murals in Mexico, which were discovered in 1946, show the story of Mayan scribes who were captured by a rival city, whose fingers are broken or otherwise mutilated, and who were in some cases executed. Those with knowledge, those loyal to an elite, those able to count the calendar round and tell the story of a dynasty, had to be illuminated by the rival dynasty. For this full and rather wretched story, you can look at an article called Broken Fingers, the Capture of the Scribe in the Classic Maya Culture. The calendar not only established authority, but it also predicted luck or ill fortune. Some days were lucky, some were not. Losing a grasp of the calendar would be losing the ability to avoid negative events and losing the ability to take advantage of positive moments. In other words, the Maya joined their compatriots in other parts of the world in believing that the stars and planets had an influence on human actions and outcomes, and they were using a long series of repeated observations to control these outcomes. Now we know there must have been a stream of skepticism in the Western world in the Renaissance about the truth of astrology. You see it in Shakespeare. The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves. I wonder whether or not that skepticism also existed within the Maya world. Here's a final point to consider about the Maya and science. The city of Palenque, with its rulers pictured here, are associated with gods who are said to have existed far, far, far into the past. These rulers were legitimated by associations with dates set fantastically early. And when I say fantastically early, I'm not kidding. The Maya conceived of time as stretching well past the simple 13.8 billion years that we believe the universe has lasted. They calculated numbers into the trillions in their calculations of time. And these numbers you can find stretching on the sides of monuments in a few key Maya sites. These numbers and the grand long count system they reference are extraordinary, almost unnecessary, extravagant, kind of extravagance of time. So we can say that time, divinity, authority, and astrology are really part of the ordinary world picture. The cultures of the Americas found their way into some fairly common worldwide solutions with reference to authority. But using trillions of calculated years is historically unique. As a social project, these calendar calculations are another kind of Maya sink of wealth. There are roads and pyramids and reservoirs, the kinds of things we see in other cultures, and about these, they say nothing. But they invested effort, energy, education, and they must have shared scholarship across rival polities for scribes to be able to calculate a king's connection to a godly being's connection to a trillion-year date. What put me onto this thought, connecting the sink of wealth to mathematical effort and training, was the Making a Mark conference at Brown University in 2016. And I put a link in the notes to where I found this idea and what got me thinking about this business of extravagant math. So for me, the Maya ability to display power, to take problems that no one needs to solve, but that science is recruited to solve, makes us kind of take a second look at the applied versus basic science distinction. Applied science helps you build an aqueduct. But by contrast, it's something more like basic science or math that helps you answer how many years into the future can you calculate a date. I wonder if the sort of ruler who would have directed a trained scribe to a politically constructed need like a grand long count calendar count to affirm his godly rulership would also give resources to like a different problem like water management or road building. What is a ruler obliged to control for legitimacy, and how does science join the effort? This is a question that keeps unfolding for me. And for me, learning more about Maya practices and their astrological or astronomical or mathematical endeavors, they all help me to think more deeply about what science does or does not do for us. And I hope it did for you too.